Welcome back. High prices have many worried and others pointing the finger at businesses, which were quick to raise prices as inflation climbed. Will they be as fast to lower as it falls? Based on the cost of goods used to make things, falling is what they're doing. Here's a look by the numbers. StatsCan said the Industrial Product Price Index for goods manufactured in Canada fell 1% in May from April and 6.3% from a year before. That's the largest price drop since October 2009, with energy and oil down 5.9%, the fourth monthly decline, and the yearly drop of 33.2%, the biggest since the start of the global pandemic lockdown. But while prices are down from their peak, they are still way above pre-pandemic levels. A lower price of oil had diesel down 8.5% and gas prices down 2.9%. Meanwhile, intermediate food prices, or food that's been processed in some way, dropped 3.8% in May from April and 13.4% from last year's levels, the biggest drop on record. Meat, fish, and dairy was one category that climbed in price, up 2.2% in May and a 4.5% increase year over year. Tight supply, especially in meat, is to blame. Meanwhile, raw materials prices are down even more sharply, 4.9% in May from April, 18.4% lower than last year's prices. Crude oils, 9.3% monthly and 32.9% annual drop was a big part of that, but metals also fell. Zinc and iron ore down both about 10%. Live animal prices were up 1.8% in May. That was the number of feed cattle in the U.S. falling for the 8th month in a row. But like that industrial products price, raw materials are down from the peak, but still incredibly elevated from their pre-pandemic levels. Bottom line, though, prices are falling at the producer level, raises the question, can consumers expect to see relief soon? The relationship between what a retailer pays and what they charge is complicated. For grocers, it could be a loaded issue, with the prospect of a windfall tax on profit headed their way if it's found they're unfairly benefiting from inflation. Karl Littler is a Senior VP of Public Affairs at the Retail Council of Canada. Karl, thanks for being with us.
Good afternoon.
So let's start with this question of how the supply chain feeds into prices. It did feel as though a lot of businesses were able to raise prices reasonably quickly on the way up. Is there a kind of a similar ratio on the way down? Should we expect to see our retail prices drop as those inflation figures come down?
Well, I think certainly competition is strong in the retail sector and strong in grocery. To the extent that you see a reduction in input costs, we would anticipate that competition will ensure that those prices are going to be adjusted accordingly. But it is a bit of a mixed story. I mean, some items are not coming down. Certainly, as you pointed out, fuel is down from its peak of last year, but nothing like pre-pandemic levels. And that's true for a lot of the inputs. Labor, of course, is not down at all. And then you have some big uncertainties. The war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, and its continuation, still continues to be a big issue for grain and all of its derivatives. Bear in mind that it's not only an input in grocery products directly, but also, of course, feeds most livestock. So those things are still very much up in the air, and it takes a while for them to certainly play through the system.
It did become, of course, for many retailers, a PR problem, Karl. We saw a real kind of sense that consumers are being ripped off here. Is that a surprise to you that this became sort of an issue with customers, that, inflation, as you say, some of the factors were incredibly global in nature, and yet there was sort of a relationship problem that emerged?
I think we have to separate two things. Obviously, consumers have had to bear the brunt of these price increases, and that angst is legitimate. And obviously, for a significant number of Canadians, issues of food insecurity and financial stress, even if they're not solely visited by rising food prices, are things that we do need to care about, and obviously we and policymakers need to take seriously. But if I can be frank, there was an element of opportunity in the blaming of grocers. There was a lot of evidence in plain sight that grocers were not taking advantage. The StatsCan put out a kind of root causes of food inflation back in November, and they, of course, attributed it to all of the global factors and some of the domestic ones. There was not one mention suggesting that that grocers were taking advantage. And of course, if you look at the Bank of Canada study that came out the other day, it found basically that retailers broadly, and grocers are a big driver of that, we're passing on cost increases one for one, but we're not taking advantage by running up margins.
We do have the Competition Bureau, as we understand it, will report next week on whether it sees a problem in the grocery space. And one of the recommendations made, of course, by a committee looking at this was this tax on excess profits. How much of a concern is that to those in the retail industry, that, you know, the specter of kind of a government deciding when something is excess and what the tax should be on it?
Well, we see the likelihood of that as extremely low for a couple of reasons. One is, just to understand, profitability in grocery is low. It is a, high volume, low margin business. And so profits across the three major grocers range from 2% to mid 4% range. But that's on all products. Typically, it's more like 2.5% on food. So you'd have to go through some real sort of intellectual convolutions in order to determine that that's excess profit in any standard. Certainly, it's way lower than most consumer-facing industries and way lower than most other suppliers in the food chain. So if you were going to look at grocery, you'd have to look elsewhere. So that's one issue. And then the second one is the Competition Bureau is not seized of this mandate. This is something of a bit of a hot potato roll down the road towards it from the Agri Committee. The Agri Committee did a decent job, but they didn't find evidence that grocers were taking advantage. So they've sort of pushed off or punted, if you like, the anything to do with excess profits, which has been part of the NDP drumbeat to the Competition Bureau, but that's never been part of the Competition Bureau's mandate.
Interesting. All right, Karl, we've got to leave it there, but it's great to have you for this. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Karl Littler is Senior VP of Public Affairs at the Retail Council of Canada. Well, whether or not grocers have unfairly kept prices high could turn on this question from the Competition Bureau of whether or not there is enough competition. It also raises the question of whether a lot of sectors are too cozy for consumers' benefit in Canada. Dany Assaf is a partner at Tory who specializes in competition law. Dany, great to have you with us.
Great to be with you, Amanda. How are you this afternoon?
We're well, and of course, we're all waiting for this report from the Bureau. We expect it now early next week on whether or not there's enough competition among grocers. Do you have a read on what the answer will be on that front? We know there's only a few very large ones. There are thousands of independent grocers. Where do you think they come down?
Well, I think they're going to come down on the fact that ultimately there is enough competition in grocery. I mean, we're all looking and struggling, and we all find it difficult when, the cost of living goes up and when it's harder for folks to make ends meet. But in the end, we need to figure out what is actually happening, what is fact from fiction, because, again, we all have to live by these rules, and we need transparency in rules, and ultimately we want the rule of law, and that somebody just doesn't turn against us, whether it's the government, whether it's the Competition Bureau, just because there's a sense or a feeling that something is out of whack. We need more than that.
Fair enough. And of course, there is this kind of sense of grievance, right, that prices are high. It's hard to argue, though, Dany, that we have somewhat kind of protected industries in this country. And we would run down the list, right, of banking, telecom. You can't say the grocers are protected, but it is a small group of large players. Is it kind of by nature, therefore, that we might be paying more than we would if there was more open markets here?
That's always a really good question, Amanda. So you've highlighted something that's really important, which is, again, we look at certain industries and we think of why are they structured the way they are. And it's important to pay attention to something you mentioned, which is protected industries. Do we have actual rules that prevent more competition, like foreign entry? And we can debate that as a country, whether that's good or bad, whether it touches on national security. But we always have to know that there's a cost to that. It means you're going to have less people come into the Canadian market. With grocery, it really isn't a protected market. And when you think of all of the variety of options there are to buy grocery, it's hard to think of how you would really kind of corner a market. So if you think of yourself as a consumer, right, we have things that we find convenient. We have things that we find close. We have all kinds of things that are important to us that make a value proposition compelling. But ultimately, if any retailer gets a little too out of whack, like they really do charge because of their market power, not because of things out of their control, like a war or a supply chain issue. Like, really, they are trying to gouge a customer.
Yeah.
I mean, are you going to sit and think, well, you know, if I have to drive an extra 2 minutes or 5 minutes or buy something online or from a smaller grocer, you're going to take that option. And I just don't see that in our community out there saying, I must go, like in, you know, the communist Soviet Union, stand in a line for food. It just doesn't have that kind of feel in my experience and as we advise on these issues to our clients.
So good to have your voice on this, Dany. Appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Amanda. Take care. Have
Dany
a great
Assaf
day.
Is a partner at Tory's. Coming up, a new law in Canada makes clean air and water a right. Will that open a legal can of worms for government? That's still ahead. But first, we really thought we could avoid this story, but with Reddit dark for a second week, here goes. The volunteer-operated site has been hit with a stop work protest after it decided to start charging third parties for access to its data. Intended to capture giant software firms and AI bots, it will also net some of the smaller players which have made Reddit function better, hence the protest. It highlights the risk of a for-profit business model which relies on volunteers. Because if there's one truth that's hard to deny, it's you get what you pay for. We're back after this.